Hello once again, and welcome to another edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. I'm joined by the AgriNews Director for 620 CKRM Regina, Ryan Young, as well as the Chief Agricultural Editor for SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hursh. I'm your host, GX94 Yorkton Agriculture Director, Doug Falconer. A number of items we wanted to talk about this week. Of course, it was a short week with Christmas Day and Boxing Day sandwiched in the middle. But Kevin, you had an interesting story this week about cover crops.
You often hear about cover crops being the big salvation for soil quality and a practice that everybody should entertain. But really, in Western Canada, there's a great deal of skepticism as to whether cover crops can really be viable or not. Maurice Bourgault, who's the Western Grains Research Foundation chair, agronomy chair at the University of Saskatchewan, is doing research into that. Basically, the idea of a cover crop is you establish another crop after harvest, so you have living roots until freeze up. And other areas are really big on this, promoting it as a practice. And certainly, if you're a Prince Edward Island potato farmer, you know the value of having cover crops after you harvest potatoes on that bare soil, or you'll get a great deal of erosion in the spring. But here in Western Canada, where moisture is often a limiting factor, there's doubt as to whether cover crops would really be viable because they're stealing some moisture from the following year's crop. And also in many areas, you barely get harvest off in time to seed another crop and establish another crop. So looking at what the true benefit of cover crops are and how they might be integrated, I think it's interesting work to look at, but whether or not it really amounts to something that becomes a common practice in Western Canada, I think has some great degree of doubt about it.
And of course, it is the season for year-end interviews. And Ryan, you dealt with a number of those this week. First of all, you spoke with Saskatchewan Agriculture Minister Daryl Harrison.
He was top of the list for year-end interviews, and we kind of covered a wide range of things, provided that he's only been in the role for the last quarter of 2024. But nonetheless, there was enough to talk about for this year. There's a lot of notable items that came around October and November, such as agribition and Donald Trump winning the election, and among other things. But first thing that we did talk about was just agribition and conversations that he heard amongst cattle groups and other cattle producers. He was able to attend the event in the mornings before he went on with his day. And generally speaking, the theme of those conversations was how high the cattle prices have been and how everybody was in a good mood about that. And we've talked about that on the roundtable for pretty much for the majority of the year, the fact that cattle prices are so high and at decade long levels, for lack of a better phrase. And optimism for next year as well, given that not only have we had timely rains in May and June and a little bit into the fall, but we also had some pretty good snowstorms and a dump of snow. So that also helps out a lot of producers, especially in areas where it's been multiple years of drought. That's really puts a smile on everybody's faces. And that was one of the highlights that Daryl Harrison talked about, him being a beef producer himself, too. So he's very happy about that. The other thing that we talked about too, leading into the next topic, was trade and concern with how relations between Canada and the United States are going to shape up moving forward, with Trump threatening 25% tariffs on Canadian goods if we don't address border security and kind of beef up security with relation to drugs and illegal immigrants and so on. So in response to that, Harrison talked about having a united front with his fellow agriculture ministers from Alberta, Ontario, Manitoba, while they're kind of letting the prime minister and the premiers kind of take the lead on that sort of thing, having kind of a Team Canada approach as we head into, I guess we'll call it NAFTA 2.0 in the heat of the moment, or CUSMA negotiations coming up in the next year or two. It's really important that everybody is on the same page and have the same approach when it comes to dealing with the U.S. And while that's the case, the ag ministers, I feel, they need to have a role in this as well. And I know that they have a bunch of contacts down in the States, multiple states, even the premiers do. So they're doing their thing with making sure that things kind of go smoothly as they can. Um, what was another thing that was talked about? Just in terms of moisture conditions, trade, labor disruptions was a big thing in our conversation as well, with CPKC and CN Rail being on that simultaneous work stoppage with the strike lockout situation. He said obviously that's a big concern, considering that we are an export-driven country, so having any disruption at all on the supply chain is not good at all, and jeopardizes our reputation as a reliable trading partner and supplier, as we've heard many times throughout the year. So that was kind of the general theme of our year-end interview with Daryl Harrison.
Kevin, not a very envious job right now to become a brand new agriculture minister for this province in light of all the things that Ryan just mentioned.
Certainly, the negotiations with the U.S. and the threat of American tariffs is going to be on everyone's agenda across the country from an economic point of view. But there'll be other issues crop up for Daryl Harrison. While the beef industry right now is enjoying some good returns, the returns are not looking as good in the grain industry. So there'll be some pressure on that front as well. But I have to wish a new agriculture minister all the best as we try to navigate these turbulent times.
Ryan, you also spoke with Grant McLellan with the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. I guess probably his comments echoed those of the ag minister.
Very much so. We spoke on the same issues when it comes to trade and his thoughts on the cattle market and the weather that we've had recently. With the weather, he's saying the same thing as well, with everybody being positive and optimistic about that, talking about the season this year as well being better than most other years recently, where the grazing season has been extended. That's been longer. Pasture conditions have been great because of the rains, and the fall cattle run being pretty good. Now, while the volumes were lower, the prices have been very high and have been high for the majority of the year. So lots of good things on the cattle front there in terms of the market and the weather as well. And he's keeping tabs on how the relations with our American counterparts will go, among other things as well. So, yeah, a lot of sentiments were echoed by Grant McLellan.
Kevin, I know you don't have cattle, but you probably have lots of friends who do. Are they finding their profit margins okay? Or are they being squeezed a bit?
Cattle side is doing well. Certainly costs are still high, but costs were high before the last increase in cattle prices. So economically, they're doing well. I got one neighbor that has expanded quite significantly with a number of cows, bought out a neighbor that was retiring. And so I think you'll see some of the established and younger producers perhaps look at it as a good time to be expanding cattle herds. But whether our entire herd will expand is another question, because there will be other producers that take the opportunity of good prices to decide it's a good time to exit the industry. And really, the proof will be in open heifers come springtime, and how many of those remain to go on to be bred heifers, and how many hit the marketplace and go to feedlots. It'll be the next thing we watch as we wonder whether we can reverse this trend of a shrinking beef cow herd and turn it around and start perhaps into an expansion mode.
All right. And of course, Ryan, you spoke with the acting president of the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, Bill Huber. And of course, everything kind of fell on his lap in August when Ray Orb stepped down.
Yeah, he did. And Ray Orb did announce his retirement that month in August after being president for the last 10 years. And Bill Huber, who was the vice president of SARM for 4 years up to that point, he took over, like you say, on an acting basis. And he summarized the year for SARM as one with a lot of change. Now, in addition to Ray Orb stepping down and him being Bill taking over, they have a new executive director as well, and a few other changes within that leadership as well moving forward. So that was kind of the one notable thing that we kind of talked about right off the hop. Another thing, too, was kind of looking ahead to next year as well. There was a lot of resolutions at the SARM midterm convention that were passed, and if anyone wants to check out those details on what's been passed, you can check out SaskAgToday.com. I asked him a few things. One of the more notable things, such as regulations around wind power projects that got a lot of traction at the convention. There's the strychnine issue. Some RM members, they want strychnine to be reinstated, and there was a whole host of other things that were approved as well. But there's a lot on SARM's plate when it comes to lobbying the provincial and federal governments for what their members want to do, what they want to see happen in terms of changes or improvements to programs, and so on.
Kevin, of course, looking ahead to the regular convention for SARM, I believe it's in March, right? So I guess, are we planning, and we will likely see a vote as to who will become the next president of SARM on a full-time basis?
Yeah, Bill Huber told me when I bumped into him at Agribition in November that he intends to plans to run as president of SARM. I thought maybe he was just serving on an interim basis and would let the presidency go to somewhere else, to someone else, but he says he fully intends to run for the president of SARM. I wouldn't be surprised to see him unopposed in that position, but that will be something to watch. There is the opportunity for someone to challenge him for the president's position, but he's been around the SARM executive for quite some time, is highly regarded. I would expect that since he wants the job, that he will be SARM president for the upcoming term.
And of course, you found some precipitation maps, Kevin, that you were checking out.
Yeah, it's interesting if you start looking at, moisture deficits. If you go back quite some time, yeah, you can show that the prairies, much of the prairies, is still in a moisture deficit situation. But if you go on the websites and pull up precipitation over the last 60 days, so I think the last map they had up there was December 23rd. So you go back the past 60 days, that means it to the end of October. So most of the precipitation that fell was snow, or it was rain that fell on top of snow. And when you look at that map, there's many areas, especially the drier areas, even much of the Regina area, but west from there, where they've had 2 times normal precipitation. And basically everything that's west of the Manitoba border is at least normal or above normal. So I think we've got really good snow cover for this early in the season. And snow cover doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have it infiltrate into the soil. It depends upon the runoff, how much it actually adds to soil moisture. But it's my anecdotal observation that when you get good runoff and you've got sloughs that are full, it tends to be a better year, and you seem to attract moisture from that. I'm sitting at the farm here, and we're at the edge of a saline slough called Boggy Lake. Well, in years when we can drive across Boggy Lake by the middle of August, is usually years where we don't have a very good crop, but years when that lake remains full, and it's very deep, but years when it remains full, it probably covers, 2 or 2.5 sections of land. Those are the years when we seem to have better crops. So I'm quite positive on having a good spring runoff in many of the areas that runoff has sometimes been lacking, and I'm looking forward to improved moisture conditions in the year to come. But we'll see how that all turns out.
Some railway news this week. Of course, I think it was on Sunday that Unifor said its members at CN Rail had ratified a new 4-year collective agreement, averting a potential strike there. And Unifor said it was included improvements to wages and benefits, as well as job protections for members working in CN terminals and headquarters across Canada. And of course, the railroad earlier this month had reached a new tentative 4-year collective agreement with the union. And they're looking forward to that. Of course, I believe it was the same day that we received word of a derailment in BC, which sent about a dozen cars, half of them into the Fraser River in BC, and the other bunch dangling there, for lack of a better term. And then, of course, we received word just on Friday of the Canadian transportation agencies, the maximum grain revenue entitlements, and CN Rail was under, but CPKC Rail was over, so they have to pay back their extra plus a penalty. What do you think of all that news, Kevin?
Well, we've had a number of years where both of the major railways were over their maximum revenue entitlement. They can vary their rates through the year, and they do quite substantially vary their rates up and down, but they try to come very close to the maximum they're allowed on that volume related inflation adjusted maximum revenue entitlement. This year, it's true, CN was actually fell below their entitlement by $34 million, which on a percentage basis is very small because the total revenue is in the billions. CP, however, was over by $1.8 million, so just slightly over on a percentage basis. That $1.8 million will be paid, as it always is if they're over the MRE, to Western Grains Research Foundation, plus a small penalty. But generally, the railways like to be right at that MRE or maybe a little bit above, and then even if they have to pay a little bit of a penalty. I know some producers, when they look at it, and when there's years where there's $3, $4, or $5 million, they say, well, why don't they pay it all back to producers? That would be very, very difficult to do on an equitable basis, to make any sense of how much producers should receive as a share of that MRE overage. So paying it to the Western Grains Research Foundation, where they can do good research work on everything from variety development to agronomy, is, in my opinion, a much better use and system for the funding.
And of course, Kevin, you also came out, imagine you found a story regarding India extending their deadline for yellow peas from Canada. Of course, there had been plans for a tariff. I believe December 31st was when they were supposed to resume. So some good news for those pulse growers out there.
Yes, and it's my understanding that's been extended for another 3 months. They waited till close to the December 31st deadline before extending the tariff exemption on yellow peas, but that should add some continued strength in that yellow pea market, I believe, to qualify for the exemption that has to be loaded by March 31st. So that will help the yellow pea market to some degree. Really is predicated on whatever pulse prices are doing, and what India thinks its domestic climate is governing. But yeah, good news, and a lot of people thought it maybe not would not be extended. So good news that it's in place for at least another 3 months.
And of course, this is our last episode of this before 2025 rolls around. And Ryan, what are you looking forward to regarding agriculture in 2025?
Well, one of the biggest things for me, actually, this kind of came to my mind a few minutes ago. The issue of foreign ownership in Saskatchewan, that was something that was kind of covered here on the program, and we had on our respective shows about the provincial auditor's report, having a very critical view of how the Ministry of Agriculture and the Farm Security Board deals with foreign ownership. Daryl Harrison had some, I guess, shall we say, questionable comments, and when pressed by reporters, he kind of struggled to answer said questions around foreign ownership. So I'm interested to see if that's going to be followed up in the next auditor's report next year, and maybe even around this time next year when the second version of the report comes out, whether the board has, made changes or improved or not, that remains to be seen. The next thing is just reliability of the supply chain. As I alluded to earlier, we've had a lot of labor disruptions from the ports. We've had strikes, lockouts at the railways, and even some grain companies that lost their licenses by the Canadian Grain Commission for failing to pay producers for grain deliveries. So I'm looking to see whether we have a rebound in terms of reliability and less job action in 2025, but that remains to be seen. So those are kind of the couple of big things for me, not the least of which we have a federal election coming up next year. So that adds a little bit of fun to the coverage for next year.
And Kevin, how about you looking forward to 2025 as a producer yourself? What are you looking forward to or keeping an eye on at least?
Well, I think there'll be a lot of carryover of issues from 2024. The Trump levy issue will continue to be a top item for agriculture and all of the economy. We'll wonder about the Chinese intentions on a possible tariff on Canadian canola. And maybe we'll see a little bit of labor rest rather than unrest, a little less labor strife in 2025, mainly because maybe we'll have fewer of those critical contracts coming up for negotiation. So that would be nice to see. I think that grain prices are likely to continue to be under pressure, and that will put some pressure on that side of the equation. And I think the whole economy is showing some signs of weakness, particularly in Canada, and that will translate into a lot of different permutations, in agriculture included.
Well, that's going to do it for this week's edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. On behalf of the AgriNews Director for 620 CKRM Regina, Ryan Young, and the Chief Agricultural Editor for SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hursh, I'm GX94 Yorkton Agriculture Director Doug Falconer saying so long until next time.